Chapter 1. The Beginning of Hell. In 1619, a ship named the White Lion docked in Point Comfort, Virginia. 20 African captives were brought to shore in chains. One of them, we'll never know his name, looked at the land in front of him. He had no idea that this moment would birth the most profitable crime syndicate in human history. A crime so perfect, so systematic, so deeply woven into the fabric of a nation that America would build its entire empire upon it. And for 246 years, they would try to bury it. This is not a history lesson, this is a crime scene, and we're about to uncover how a nation got rich on human flesh. From 1525 to 1866, over 300 years, the largest human trafficking operation in history operated in plain sight. We sanitize it. We call it the transatlantic slave trade. What it really was, genocide by economic design. 12.5 million Africans were ripped from their homes, their families, their identities, chained, branded, stuffed into the holds of slave ships like sardines in a can. The conditions below deck. Imagine the worst thing you've ever imagined, then multiply it by the smell of human waste, disease, and death. Olaudah Equiano was taken as a child in 1756. He survived the Middle Passage, the nightmare ocean journey, and later he wrote, "The stench of the hold while we were on the coast was so intolerably loathsome that it was dangerous to remain there even for a short time. Some of my unfortunate countrymen were so overcome by the air they fainted from the air, from the sheer concentration of human suffering." And here's the thing, 1.8 million people never made it across the Atlantic. 1.8 million. They died in those holds, died screaming, died in the dark, died so far from home that their families would never know what happened to them. Before they ever set foot in America, before they ever worked a single day, 1.8 million Africans were already dead, and the ships kept coming. Year after year, decade after decade, century after century, the numbers are so enormous that they stop being real. They become statistics, and statistics are easy to ignore, but they weren't statistics. They were people. Abina Busha, a scholar who has dedicated her life to this history, put it this way: the story of the African in the Americas begins with a river of tears and a trail of blood. That's not poetic language. That's a forensic description. Now let's get specific. 1619, Virginia colony, Point Comfort. A port settlement so small that most maps wouldn't even mark it. A ship, the White Lion, carries 20 enslaved Africans. The captain, a man named John Colon, makes a decision. He decides to trade these people for supplies, for corn, for livestock. The transaction happens. The paperwork is filed. No one realizes what just happened. This moment, this single trade, becomes the birth certificate of American racial slavery. But here's what's crucial. This wasn't inevitable. 1619 wasn't the beginning of slavery in the Americas. Spain had enslaved people for over a century. Portugal had been trading in enslaved Africans since the 1400s, but 1619 was different because in Virginia, something new was born. Before 1619, the colonies had a problem. They were desperate for labor, but they didn't know how to control it long term. They tried indentured servants from Europe, desperate people who signed contracts to work for 5 to 10 years in exchange for passage to the New World. But it wasn't enough. And there was a bigger problem. Indentured servants eventually went free. They left. They wanted land. They wanted rights. They couldn't be controlled forever. So the colonists made a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice. They decided that some humans were different, that some humans could be property, that some humans could work forever, and they chose Africans. Not because Africans were naturally suited to slavery. That's a racist lie we've been told for 400 years. But because they were far from home, because they looked different, because they could be controlled through terror, and because, this is the crucial part, they couldn't fight back in a system that didn't recognize them as human. It was a choice, a calculated, evil, profitable choice. For 50 years after 1619, slavery wasn't as rigidly defined as it would become. The laws were messy, contradictory, unclear. Some enslaved Africans eventually gained their freedom. Some worked alongside European indentured servants. The system hadn't yet been fully systematized. Then came 1675, and everything changed. The Virginia House of Burgesses, the colonial legislature, passed a law. a seemingly simple law, a law that would become the legal foundation for centuries of horror. The law stated that any child born to an enslaved mother would themselves be enslaved for life, forever, no expiration date, no hope of freedom, no escape clause. Do you understand what that means? This wasn't just a law, this was the legal erasure of humanity itself. A human being became property, owned like a chair, owned like a horse, inherited like real estate, sold like cattle. But there was something even more sinister about this law. It was designed specifically to trap women. If you're a woman and you're enslaved, you will be raped. And if you have a child from that rape, that child, that innocent child, is also enslaved for life. The law made rape profitable. It made rape an investment strategy, and the colonists knew it. In fact, the law was deliberately written this way. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't an oversight. William Byrd II, one of Virginia's wealthiest planners, understood exactly what he had created. In his diary, he bragged about his enslaved children, children born from rape, as assets on his estate. He bragged about it. Now, you might think, surely the people who wrote this law understood they were doing something wrong. You'd be right. Benjamin Franklin knew, Thomas Jefferson knew, George Washington knew. They understood that slavery violated every principle they claimed to believe in. They understood it was morally indefensible. Benjamin Franklin saw the obscene hypocrisy clearly. He wrote, "Britain prides itself on being a beacon of liberty, on freeing enslaved people the moment they step on English soil, and yet Britain profits enormously from the slave trade itself." He was pointing at something obvious. The contradiction was transparent. Everyone could see it. And yet, nothing changed, because by the 1670s, slavery had become too profitable to stop, too woven into the colonial economy, too central to how the wealthy accumulated power. The choice had been made. Profit came before principle, and that choice would echo through 246 years of American history. For 150 years after 1675, slavery existed. It was brutal, it was dehumanizing, it was evil, but it was also, in some places, slowly dying. By the 1770s, many northern states were beginning to abolish slavery. It was no longer economically essential. The Industrial Revolution was beginning. Manufacturing was replacing agriculture as the engine of wealth. In the North, slavery became inconvenient. In the South, it remained profitable but not explosively so. And then, in 1793, something happened. A man named Eli Whitney invented a machine called the cotton gin. 3 words, 1 invention. Everything changes. Before the cotton gin, processing cotton was a nightmare. You had to separate the seeds from the fiber by hand. A single worker could process about 1 pound of cotton per day. 1 pound per day. At that rate, growing cotton on a massive scale wasn't worth it. The labor costs were too high, the profits too thin. Then Whitney's cotton gin changed the equation. Suddenly, a single worker could process 50 pounds of cotton per day, then 100, then more. Processing speed increased by 5,000%. And what happened next was predictable. Suddenly, cotton became phenomenally profitable. The demand exploded. Plantation owners looked at their ledgers and realized, we need more enslaved people. We need more land. We need to expand fast. The demand for enslaved labor didn't gradually increase. It skyrocketed. By 1800, the American South had 900,000 enslaved people. By 1860, there were 4 million. In 60 years, the enslaved population of the South quadrupled. This wasn't gradual. This wasn't organic. This was industrial expansion powered by human suffering. A doctor in the South, John Cartwright, wrote about what he observed. The very instant the cotton gin was introduced, the South's appetite for slaves became voracious. It was as if a hunger had been unleashed that could never be satisfied. By 1850, the South was producing 4 million bales of cotton per year, and by 1860, cotton accounted for more than half of all American exports. More than half. America's entire position as a global power was built on one crop, picked by enslaved hands, sold by enslaved labor, built on enslaved suffering. The South Senator James Henry Hammond said it plainly in 1858, "Cotton is king, and no power dares make war upon it." He wasn't exaggerating. Britain, the world's dominant superpower at the time, depended on Southern cotton for its textile industry. The entire British Industrial Revolution ran on cotton picked by enslaved Americans. They had created a kingdom of evil, and the whole world was complicit in it. Here's where the story gets twisted in a way that most people don't understand. America was founded on a lie. All men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Those aren't just words. They were a revolution. They were a challenge to every monarchy, every empire, every system of oppression in the world. And the world listened. Revolutions erupted across Europe, inspired by America's promise of freedom. But while Thomas Jefferson was writing those words, writing them in Philadelphia, he owned over 600 people in slavery, while Benjamin Franklin was meeting with other founders to declare that all men are equal. He was investing in the slave trade. While George Washington was speaking about human liberty, he was whipping enslaved people on his plantation. This isn't hypocrisy. It's something darker. It's a foundational lie, a lie embedded in America's DNA. By 1860, this lie had metastasized into an economic reality. Enslaved people represented about 13% of the U.S. population, but their economic value was staggering. Economists have calculated that enslaved people were worth approximately $3.5 billion in the money of that time. That's nearly $1 trillion in today's money. More valuable than every railroad, every factory, every bank, every piece of industrial infrastructure in the South combined. They weren't just workers. They were the wealth itself. Living, breathing, suffering capital. And America had become addicted to that wealth. The nation's banks were built on it. The nation's trade networks depended on it. Entire fortunes were built by treating human beings like commodities. By 1860, the United States had a choice to make. It had to choose between the lie it was founded on, that all men are equal, and the wealth it had built on the opposite principle, between freedom and slavery, between humanity and profit. It couldn't choose both anymore. The contradiction had become unsustainable. And so, in 1831, something began. A movement, a resistance, an uprising. A preacher named Nat Turner would lead a rebellion so violent, so desperate, so determined that it would send terror through the entire South. But before we get to the rebellions, before we get to the violence that tore the nation apart, you need to understand something even darker than what you've heard. Slavery wasn't just about making people work. It was about breeding, about systematically raping women to create a new generation of enslaved people as property. It was about turning human reproduction into an industrial process. It was about multiplying suffering through generations. And it was something so dark, so obscene, that America spent 150 years trying to forget it happened. But it did happen, and the evidence is still there, buried in plantation records, in court documents, in the DNA of millions of Americans. The evidence of a crime so profound that it still haunts this nation. In Chapter 2, we follow the money. We show you exactly how the wealthiest families in America built their empires on this system, how the North profited even as it claimed to oppose slavery, how the entire structure of American capitalism is built on stolen labor and stolen lives. You're not ready for what you're about to see, but you need to know it. Chapter 2. The Money Trail, Follow the Money. That's what every detective says. Follow the money, and you find the crime. Follow the money, and you find the criminals. So let's follow the money. Let's trace every dollar that flowed through American slavery. Let's see where it went, who profited, who got rich, and how the wealth of a nation was built on the backs of enslaved people. The numbers are so staggering that they almost seem unreal, but they're not. They're historical fact. By 1860, enslaved people in America were worth approximately $3.5 billion. That's in the currency of that era. In today's money, adjusted for inflation, that's nearly $1 trillion. To put that in perspective, in 1860, the total value of all American real estate, every house, every building, every piece of land in the entire country, was worth about $16 billion. Enslaved people alone, human beings treated as property, represented more than 20% of the entire nation's wealth. More than railroads, more than factories, more than banks, more than gold, more than anything else. The enslaved people of the South were literally worth more than all the industrial infrastructure of the North combined. They were the nation's greatest asset, the engine that powered everything. And here's what most people don't understand. This wealth wasn't just in the South. It flowed everywhere. It corrupted everything. Northern banks provided loans to Southern planters, and they used enslaved people as collateral. Imagine that. A bank executive sits down with a plantation owner. The plantation owner says, "I need money to buy more enslaved people. I need money to expand my cotton operations." And the bank says, "Sure. How much collateral do you have?" The plantation owner pulls out a list. Enslaved people, names, ages, market value. He's literally using human beings as collateral on a loan. The bank agrees. The loan is made. The enslaved people, who have no idea their bodies have been mortgaged, now work even harder because the prophet has to pay back the loan with interest. This was happening in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia. Northern banks were literally betting on slavery, betting that enslaved labor would remain profitable, betting that the system would last forever. One historian calculated that between 1790 and 1860, Northern banks issued loans worth over $50 million using enslaved people as collateral. $50 million. And that doesn't include the direct investments in slave ships, the direct investments in plantations, the direct investments in the slave trade itself. Northern merchants got rich too. Merchants in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, they built fortunes by financing slave ships. The ships would sail to Africa, pick up enslaved people, sail to the Caribbean or the South, sell the people, buy sugar or cotton or tobacco, and sail back to New England. One voyage of a slave ship could generate profits of 50, 60, sometimes 100%. One voyage. That's why merchants did it over and over. That's why they risked everything to participate in the slave trade. A merchant ship owner named Captain John Brown, based in Rhode Island, operated slave ships for decades. He made millions. Millions. When he died, he was considered one of the wealthiest men in America. His wealth came entirely from trafficking enslaved people. And these weren't bad men hidden in the shadows. These were respectable businessmen, community leaders. They went to church. They had families. They were considered pillars of society, and they were getting filthy rich on slavery. The money went everywhere. Insurance companies insured slave ships. Insurance companies insured enslaved people themselves in case they died or were damaged en route. That's right. You could buy insurance on an enslaved person's life. If the person died, you collected the insurance money. Slave traders advertised in newspapers, regular newspapers. The New York Times had advertisements from slave traders. The Boston Globe carried slave auction notices. This was normal. This was business as usual. Wealthy families in the North built their empires on slavery money. The Vanderbilts had connections to the slave trade. The Astors had connections to slavery financing. Many of the great family fortunes that still exist today, that still control vast wealth, were built, at least in part, on slavery profits. One of the great contradictions of America is this. The people who claimed to oppose slavery in the North were often profiting enormously from slavery in the South. They said slavery was wrong, but they sold the ships that transported enslaved people. They financed the plantation owners. They bought the cotton produced by enslaved labor. They sold slave-produced goods all over the world. William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, pointed this out. Every man who eats the bread of slavery is a man-stealer. He understood that slavery wasn't a Southern problem, it was an American problem, and everyone, North and South, had blood on their hands. But the real money, the massive generational wealth, was in the South. For a Southern planter, enslaved people weren't just workers. They were investments. They were wealth generators. They were literally the path to becoming rich. Here's how it worked. A planter starts with, say, 50 enslaved people. These people produce cotton. Cotton is sold. The money flows back to the planter. The planter doesn't spend that money on wages because enslaved people don't get paid. The money is pure profit. The planter takes that profit and buys more enslaved people. Now he has 100 enslaved people. They produce more cotton, more profit. He buys more enslaved people. The cycle accelerates. Within a generation, a man could go from owning 50 enslaved people to owning 500, from being wealthy to being fabulously wealthy, to being one of the richest men in America. But there's something even more sinister. Enslaved people reproduced. Women were systematically raped to create more enslaved people. And these children, born into slavery, increased your wealth. You didn't have to buy them. You didn't have to invest money. They just appeared, like interest on an investment. An enslaved woman gave birth. Boom. Your wealth increased. Your assets multiplied for no additional cost. A plantation owner in South Carolina named Robert Manson understood this perfectly. He kept meticulous records. He noted with apparent satisfaction that his enslaved population had increased by 47% in a single decade due to births. He calculated the dollar value of each child born. He treated human reproduction as a profit center. This is why the South became so obsessed with slavery. It wasn't just about labor. It was about generational wealth. It was about having your assets literally reproduce themselves. By the 1850s, the South had become a slave society in every sense of the word. Every institution supported slavery. Every law protected slavery. Every economic structure depended on slavery. The entire society was built around the extraction of wealth from enslaved people's labor. And this wealth was flowing upward, concentrating in fewer and fewer hands. By 1860, a small planter class, maybe 50,000 families, controlled most of the wealth in the South. They owned the vast majority of enslaved people. They controlled the government. They controlled the military. They controlled everything. A man might own thousands of enslaved people. Thousands. His wealth would be so immense that it would take generations to count it. And all of it came from slavery. All of it came from the forced labor of human beings who received no compensation, no freedom, no hope. For these men, slavery wasn't an ethical question. Slavery was business, and business was good. When cotton prices rose, plantation owners got richer. When cotton prices fell, plantation owners still got rich. They just forced enslaved people to work harder to make up for the lower prices. The enslaved people bore the cost, always. And the system seemed perfect. It seemed like it could last forever. It seemed like a perpetual money machine. The North was making money, the South was making money, Britain was making money, everyone was getting rich, which is exactly why people fought so hard to keep it alive, which is exactly why people would soon be willing to tear the nation apart to preserve it. The money was too good, the wealth was too intoxicating, the power was too seductive, and the cost, the human cost, didn't matter. Because enslaved people weren't counted as human. They were counted as capital. They were counted in ledgers, not in obituaries. They were counted as assets, not as people. But here's something that's often forgotten. For all this wealth, for all this economic success, the South was slowly falling behind. Economically, politically, intellectually. The North was industrializing. Factories were rising. New technologies were being invented. Cities were growing. Immigration was increasing, wealth was diversifying, the North's economy was becoming dynamic, complex, innovative. The South's economy was static, built entirely on one crop, entirely on one form of labor. It was extraordinarily profitable, but extraordinarily fragile. If you remove slavery, the entire economy collapses. If you remove cotton, the entire society collapses. The South had made a devil's bargain: short-term unlimited wealth, long-term total vulnerability. And deep down, Southern leaders knew it, which is why they became increasingly paranoid, increasingly defensive, increasingly willing to use violence to protect slavery. They understood, even if they wouldn't admit it, that their way of life was doomed, that slavery was becoming less defensible, that the world was moving against them. So they doubled down. They passed harsher laws. They cracked down on any form of dissent. They began to imagine conspiracies against them, conspiracies from the North, conspiracies from Europe, conspiracies from enslaved people themselves. They were right to be paranoid, because the system, this beautiful, profitable machine of slavery, was starting to crack, and the cracks were becoming fissures. And the fissures would soon become a chasm that no amount of money could bridge. By 1860, the moment of reckoning was approaching. The South had to choose: keep slavery and risk everything, or abandon slavery and try to rebuild. They chose to keep slavery. They chose to fight. They chose to risk their entire nation. And that choice, that terrible, desperate choice, would lead to the bloodiest war in American history. A war that would kill 620,000 people. A war that would consume the nation. A war over whether enslaved people could be freed. But before that war came, before the violence and the blood and the death, before America tore itself apart, there was another chapter, a chapter of defiance, a chapter of resistance, because enslaved people didn't accept their fate. They didn't accept that they were property. They didn't accept that they would work forever for nothing. They rebelled, they resisted, they fought back. And their resistance, their desperate, courageous resistance, would ultimately shake the foundations of the entire system. Chapter 3. Breeding Grounds of Hell. Now we descend deeper into the machinery of slavery itself, into the system that wasn't just about labor, it was about control, about domination, about the systematic breeding of enslaved people like livestock. Most people don't want to talk about this part of slavery because it's unspeakably dark, because it reveals something about slavery that's almost too horrible to comprehend. But we have to talk about it because this is what slavery really was. Not just hard work, not just oppression, but systematic rape, systematic breeding, the turning of human reproduction into an industrial process. Let's start with the plantations themselves. The southern plantation wasn't a farm, it was a factory for the production of cotton. And like any factory, it needed raw materials, equipment, and labor. The labor was enslaved people, but enslaved people are different from machines. They wear out, they die, they get sick, they resist, they escape. So the plantation owners faced a constant problem. How do we replace the labor we lose? The solution was simple: breeding. Enslaved women were treated as reproductive machines. Their job wasn't just to work the fields, their job was to have children, children that would be born into slavery, children who would work the fields, children who would have children. A pregnant enslaved woman was valuable property. Her child, once born, increased the owner's wealth. An enslaved child could be valued at anywhere from $200 to $500, depending on the child's age and perceived future earning potential. In other words, a plantation owner could literally profit from an enslaved woman's pregnancy. He could be making money while she carried a child, making money from her suffering. And this was deliberate. Plantation owners encouraged or forced enslaved women to have children young, very young, as soon as they hit puberty. There are plantation records that document this. Breeding records. Just like you'd keep records for cattle, lists of enslaved women, their ages, how many children they'd had, how many children they were expected to have. One plantation owner in Louisiana kept detailed records. He noted that he was particularly interested in acquiring young enslaved women in their childbearing years. He calculated how many children each woman could produce over her lifetime. He assigned each woman a value based on her expected reproductive output. He was treating human beings like breeding stock, like livestock, like machines, and the way women were forced to reproduce through rape, systematic, institutionalized rape. An enslaved woman had no legal protection, no right to refuse, no right to bodily autonomy. If a plantation owner wanted to rape her, he could. If a white overseer wanted to rape her, he could. If any white man wanted to rape her, he could. And the children born from these rapes, they were enslaved, born into slavery as a result of rape. One enslaved woman named Harriet Jacobs wrote about her experience. She was sexually harassed constantly by her owner from the time she was 12 years old. 12. By the time she was 14, her owner was raping her regularly. Over 7 years, he raped her hundreds of times, and she could do nothing. The law gave her no protection. She wrote, "I was a woman and was supposed to have no higher aspiration than to be the mistress of some white man." That was the fate of enslaved women, not to be wives, not to have families of their own choosing, but to be sexual property, to be used, to be raped. Another enslaved woman named Celia fought back. Her owner repeatedly raped her for years. She begged him to stop. She told him she was pregnant. She told him it was killing her. He didn't care. Finally, in desperation, she killed him. She hit him with a stick to stop his attack. He died from the injuries. It was self-defense. It was survival. She was tried in court. The law said that enslaved people couldn't legally defend themselves against their owners, no matter what the owner did, no matter how brutal the abuse. An enslaved person couldn't raise a hand in self-defense. Celia was convicted, sentenced to death. She was executed while pregnant, and this was legal. This was the law of the land. A woman, a pregnant woman, executed for defending herself against rape. The system created a situation where enslaved women had no escape, no protection, no options. They could be raped with impunity. Their children could be sold away at any moment. Their families could be torn apart. Some enslaved women tried to prevent pregnancy. They used herbal contraceptives. They tried to induce miscarriages because they understood that bearing children would condemn those children to slavery. It was an act of resistance, a refusal to perpetuate the system. But even this was dangerous. A plantation owner who discovered that an enslaved woman was preventing pregnancy would punish her severely because preventing pregnancy was preventing profit, was preventing him from becoming wealthier. The breeding system was efficient, ruthless. It generated wealth. It perpetuated slavery. It ensured a constant supply of enslaved labor, but it also created something unexpected: mixed-race children, children of white plantation owners and enslaved women. These children, often very light-skinned, challenged the racial logic of slavery. The South's racial ideology depended on the idea that black people were fundamentally different, inferior, unsuited to freedom. But when a plantation owner's own children, his biological children, were born into slavery, it became harder to maintain that fiction. So the South had to get creative. They passed laws that said a child's status follows the mother's status. This meant that a white plantation owner could rape an enslaved woman, and the child would be born enslaved. The child would be property. And this wasn't seen as a contradiction or a horror. It was seen as normal, as the way things worked. This system, this deliberate breeding system, had an enormous impact on slavery as an institution. It meant that enslaved people were valued not just for their immediate labor, but for their potential to produce more enslaved people. It meant that enslaved women were valued in particular for their reproductive capacity. It meant that rape wasn't an occasional abuse. It was built into the system. It was part of the machinery. And the children born from rape? They were part of the wealth. They were part of the profit. They were part of the system that enslaved their mothers. By the time of the Civil War, approximately 37% of enslaved people in the United States had some European ancestry. 37%, most of them born as a result of rape. Think about that number. Over a third of the enslaved population was the direct result of systematic sexual violence, and all of them were trapped in a system that was explicitly designed to prevent their freedom, to breed them like livestock, to extract their labor, to tear apart their families. The plantation system was built on this foundation, on the forced reproductive labor of enslaved women, on the systematic rape of enslaved people, on the treatment of human beings as breeding stock. And for 150 years, this system functioned. It was profitable. It was sustainable. It seemed like it would last forever. But systems built on violence, on oppression, on the denial of humanity, they don't last forever. They create resistance. They create rebellion. They create people willing to fight back with every ounce of their being. And that's where our story goes next, to the people who refused to accept their fate, to the people who rose up, to the rebellions that shook the South to its core and proved that enslaved people were not docile, not content, not willing to accept slavery forever. Chapter 4. Sparks of Defiance. In the darkness of slavery, there were sparks, moments of defiance, acts of courage that proved that no system of oppression is absolute, that no amount of violence can completely crush the human spirit. Enslaved people did not accept their fate. They fought back. They resisted. They rebelled. The resistance took many forms. Sometimes it was subtle. Sometimes it was violent. Sometimes it was desperate. Sometimes it was planned. But it was always there. In the fields, in the quarters, in the hearts of people who refused to be reduced to property. Work slowdowns. That was one tactic. An enslaved person would work at a deliberately slow pace, break tools, feign illness, disrupt the plantation's productivity. It was subtle enough that the enslaver might not be able to prove deliberate sabotage, but the effect was clear. The work wasn't getting done. Profits were falling. Frederick Douglass observed this. He wrote, "The slaves were not contented with their lot. They found ways to slow the work, to resist the overseer, to make their oppression known. But there were more dramatic forms of resistance too. Escape. Enslaved people risked everything to escape. They fled through swamps. They hid in forests. They traveled hundreds of miles on foot through enemy territory. The Underground Railroad, A network of safe houses and helpers assisted enslaved people in their flight to the north. Harriet Tubman was an enslaved woman who escaped in 1849. She was free for only 2 years before she did something extraordinary. She went back to the South again and again, and she led other enslaved people to freedom. Over the course of approximately 13 years, Harriet Tubman led around 70 enslaved people to freedom. 70. She never lost a passenger. She was so successful that plantation owners offered a reward for her capture, thousands of dollars, but no one ever turned her in. She said, "I had reasoned that there was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death." That was her choice. She chose liberty or death, and she was willing to kill anyone, including herself, to secure it. William Still was another conductor on the Underground Railroad. He was a free black man based in Philadelphia. Over the course of his work, he helped more than 800 enslaved people escape to safety. 800. He kept detailed records. He wrote down names, stories, the details of their escape. He created a written record of the Underground Railroad's work, and then he compiled it into a book, the most comprehensive chronicle of the Underground Railroad ever written. He wrote, "The heroism shown by the slaves who undertook the perilous journey to freedom should be forever remembered. Escape was one form of resistance, but there was also rebellion, open, violent rebellion against the system of slavery itself. The Stono Rebellion happened in 1739 in South Carolina. An enslaved man named Jemmy led a group of enslaved Africans in an uprising. They burned plantations. They attacked slaveholders. They killed at least 20 white people. The rebellion lasted several days before it was crushed by the militia, but it sent a clear message. Enslaved people would fight back. They would use violence. They would risk death to resist slavery." Historian Peter Wood wrote, "The Stono Rebellion was the largest slave revolt in Britain's mainland colonies. It demonstrated the potential for organized resistance and the deep anger that simmered beneath the surface of plantation life." 200 years later, in 1831, there was another rebellion. This one was even more shocking. It was led by a man named Nat Turner. Nat Turner was an enslaved preacher, a man of faith. He lived in Virginia, and in 1831, he became convinced that God was calling him to lead a rebellion. He gathered followers, enslaved men, some free black men, about 70 people in total, and they rose up. They attacked plantations. They killed slaveholders. The violence was severe. It was brutal. More than 50 white people were killed. 50. It was the largest and bloodiest slave rebellion in American history. The rebellion was crushed. Turner was captured. He was tried. He was executed by hanging. But before his execution, Turner said something extraordinary. He said, "I am loaded with chains, but this is nothing compared to how I have been bound by my fellow creatures." He understood. The physical chains were nothing compared to the chains of slavery itself, the chains of a system designed to erase his humanity. His rebellion terrified the South. It proved that enslaved people were not content, that they would not accept slavery forever, that they were willing to die in the attempt to gain freedom. And the South responded with even more brutal repression. After Nat Turner's rebellion, Southern states passed harsher laws, laws that made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read, laws that restricted enslaved people's movement, laws that made rebellion punishments more severe. The South was responding to the threat it felt, the threat that enslaved people would organize, that they would fight back. And they were right to be afraid, because there was also the German Coast Uprising. It happened in 1811 in Louisiana. Between 2,000 and 5,000 enslaved people rose up. They armed themselves. They marched on New Orleans. They were intent on capturing the city itself. This wasn't a small rebellion. This was an organized, large-scale military action. An army of enslaved people, marching, burning plantations, killing slaveholders. The rebellion was crushed by the militia. Over 100 enslaved people were killed. Many were executed. Some were beheaded. Their heads were placed on pikes as a warning to other enslaved people. But the scale of the rebellion was unprecedented. Thousands of enslaved people coordinated action, organized an attack, attempted to overthrow the system. One of the rebellion leaders said, "We will show these whites that we are men, not beasts of burden." That was the message. Enslaved people were human. They were men and women. They would not accept being treated as animals. They would fight back. But resistance wasn't just violent. There was also cultural resistance, spiritual resistance. Enslaved people created their own music, spirituals, songs with double meanings, songs that seemed to be about Jesus and heaven, but were actually about freedom and escape. Steal Away to Jesus was a spiritual song on plantations, but the hidden meaning was steal away to freedom. Wade in the Water was another. The literal meaning was about baptism. The hidden meaning was escape through water where the dogs can't track you. Frederick Douglass wrote, "The spirituals are full of double meanings. They describe the enslaved people's longing for freedom and their defiance of the system." Enslaved people also maintained their own religions. They practiced African religions in secret: voodoo, hoodoo, conjure, religions that connected them to their ancestors, to their homelands, to something beyond the plantation. They held secret meetings, brush arbor meetings, hush harbors, places where enslaved people could gather without being seen by overseers, where they could practice their own religion, where they could connect with each other as human beings. In New Orleans, enslaved people were allowed to gather on Sundays in Congo Square. They danced, they drummed, they sang. They kept African traditions alive. They preserved their culture in the face of a system designed to erase it. They created families in the face of a system designed to tear families apart. They maintained names, African names, names that connected them to their ancestors, names that asserted their identity beyond slavery. Sojourner Truth was an enslaved woman who escaped. She chose her own name, Sojourner Truth. She didn't accept the name given to her by slavery. She claimed her own identity, her own humanity. She became a powerful voice for abolition and women's rights. She traveled the country giving speeches, powerful, beautiful, defiant speeches about the humanity of enslaved people, about the rights of women, about the need to overturn the entire system. She said, "I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me, and ain't I a woman?" She was asserting her humanity, her dignity, her right to be treated as a full human being. All of this, the escapes, the rebellions, the cultural preservation, the spiritual resistance, the refusal to be degraded, all of it proved something fundamental. Slavery could crush bodies. Slavery could kill spirits. Slavery could create systems of legal oppression. But slavery could not completely destroy the human desire for freedom. It could not completely erase humanity from enslaved people. Even in the darkest conditions, enslaved people found ways to resist, to assert their humanity, to maintain hope. And their resistance, their desperate, courageous, beautiful resistance, was setting the stage for something larger, for a national crisis, for a tearing apart of the nation itself. Because slavery couldn't last forever, not with enslaved people refusing to accept it, not with the North gradually turning against it, not with the contradictions of American ideology becoming impossible to ignore. The reckoning was coming, and it would be violent, and it would fundamentally transform the nation. Chapter 5. The crisis that tore a nation apart. By the 1830s, something fundamental was changing in America. The contradiction between the nation's founding ideals and its practice of slavery had become impossible to ignore. A movement was rising, the abolitionist movement. People, both white and black, who believed that slavery must be ended, immediately, completely. In 1831, a journalist named William Lloyd Garrison founded a newspaper called The Liberator. It was an abolitionist publication. Garrison used the paper to attack slavery without mercy. He wrote, "I will be as harsh as truth. I do not wish to think with moderation." He wasn't calling for gradual abolition. He wasn't calling for compromise. He was calling for the immediate, unconditional end of slavery. His words were incendiary. They enraged the South. They inspired abolitionists in the North. They forced Americans to take a stand. Either you supported slavery or you opposed it. There was no middle ground. Other abolitionists joined Garrison. Frederick Douglass, the formerly enslaved man who had escaped and become a powerful speaker and writer. Sojourner Truth, the formerly enslaved woman who traveled the country giving speeches. Harriet Tubman, who conducted enslaved people to freedom, and many others. They wrote, they spoke, they organized, they built a movement that grew more powerful each year. In 1852, a woman named Harriet Beecher Stowe published a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin. It was an extraordinary book. It told the story of enslaved people. It portrayed them as fully human. It showed the horror and cruelty of slavery in vivid detail. The book became a bestseller. It was read by millions, and it changed public opinion, particularly in the North. Northerners read Uncle Tom's Cabin and began to see slavery not as a distant Southern problem, but as a moral catastrophe. Stowe wrote in her novel, "The law of God cannot be repealed by any human enactment." It was a radical statement. It was saying that slavery was so morally wrong that no law could make it legal, no government could make it acceptable. The South was outraged. They saw the abolitionist movement as a threat to their way of life, and they were right. The abolitionists wanted to completely destroy slavery, to end it forever. So the South dug in. They passed harsher laws. They made it illegal to teach enslaved people to read. They restricted enslaved people's movement. They made it harder for enslaved people to gather. And they also began to actively defend slavery, not just economically, but morally, philosophically. Southern intellectuals began to argue that slavery was actually good, that it was morally justified, that enslaved people were incapable of freedom, that slavery protected them, cared for them, was better for them. It was a complete inversion of morality, but it showed how desperate the South had become, how threatened they felt by the abolitionist movement. The tension between North and South began to escalate. Political crises erupted. Each crisis seemed to push the nation closer to breaking apart. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Act. This law said that all Americans, North and South, had a responsibility to help catch fugitive enslaved people. If an enslaved person escaped to the North, Northerners could be compelled to help recapture them. They could be compelled to become slave catchers. The law outraged the North. Northerners who had opposed slavery found themselves forced to participate in its enforcement. Many northern states passed personal liberty laws in response, laws that contradicted the Fugitive Slave Act, that protected escaped enslaved people in Northern Territory. The contradiction was becoming unbridgeable. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act. This law said that new territories could decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. It overturned previous compromises. It set the stage for open conflict over slavery's expansion. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces flooded into Kansas. They fought each other violently. The territory became a battleground. It was called Bleeding Kansas because of the violence, because of the bloodshed, because enslaved and free people were literally fighting each other over the future of slavery in the territory. A political movement emerged, the Republican Party, founded in 1854 on the platform of opposing slavery's expansion. The Republican Party was explicitly formed to fight slavery. The first Republican presidential candidate was John C. Fremont. His campaign slogan was, "Free soil, free speech, free labor, free men." It was a direct challenge to slavery. It said that America should be a nation of free people, that enslaved labor was incompatible with American ideals. Southern states heard this message clearly. They understood that a Republican president would threaten slavery, so they waited and they watched the elections closely. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Lincoln was a Republican. Lincoln opposed the expansion of slavery. The South saw his election as a declaration of war. South Carolina seceded from the Union. Then other southern states followed: Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas, North Carolina, Virginia. They formed the Confederate States of America, a new nation explicitly dedicated to slavery, explicitly dedicated to preserving the right to enslave people. The South was choosing war over the possibility of slavery being restricted, and the war came. In April 1861, Confederate forces attacked Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The American Civil War began. It would be the bloodiest war in American history. It would last 4 years. It would kill approximately 620,000 people. And it was fundamentally a war over slavery, over whether enslaved people would be freed, over whether America would be a nation that recognized slavery or a nation that rejected it. For the first 2 years of the war, President Lincoln didn't make it about slavery. He said the war was to preserve the Union, to prevent the nation from breaking apart. But increasingly, it became clear that the war was about slavery, and that the only way to win the war was to free enslaved people, to use emancipation as a weapon against the South. On January 1, 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that enslaved people in Confederate states were free. It wasn't a complete abolition of slavery. It didn't free enslaved people in the Union border states. But it was a revolutionary moment. It declared that the United States government was now using its power to free enslaved people. Enslaved people heard this news and understood what it meant. Freedom was coming. Not eventually. Now. Soon. Enslaved people began to escape to Union lines. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. They heard that the Union was freeing enslaved people, and they fled to Union territory. And some of them did something remarkable. They joined the Union Army. They became soldiers. They picked up weapons and fought against slavery. The 54th Massachusetts Regiment was one of the most famous. It was an African-American regiment, black soldiers fighting to free their own people. They fought in battles. They bled. They died. They killed enemy soldiers. They proved that black men could be soldiers, that black men would fight for freedom. And by the end of the war, approximately 180,000 black soldiers had served in the Union Army. 180,000. The war dragged on, battle after battle, death after death. The North, with its superior industrial capacity, gradually wore down the South. In 1865, the South surrendered, the war was over, and slavery was dying. In fact, Congress had passed the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery throughout the United States. It was ratified in December 1865. For the first time, slavery was illegal in America. The institution that had defined the nation for 246 years was gone. But the fight for freedom wasn't over, because ending slavery was one thing. Ensuring that freed people could actually live as free people was quite another. The struggle would continue for years, for decades. In fact, the struggle continues today. But that is another chapter in this story. That is the story of Reconstruction, of the attempt to rebuild the South, of the fight for civil rights that would continue for another 100 years. For now, we have to reckon with what we've learned. We have to understand what happened, how a nation was built on slavery, how enslaved people resisted, how a war tore the nation apart, how a system of oppression was finally defeated. Chapter 6. The Legacy That Will Not Die. We have reached the end of slavery. The institution is gone. The legal system that protected it has been dismantled. The Confederate States have been defeated. But has slavery truly ended? Or does its legacy persist? Does it still haunt the nation? The answer is complicated and troubling. Slavery ended in 1865, but the racism that slavery created, the ideology that had justified slavery, that continued, and it evolved into new forms of oppression. Immediately after slavery ended, the South began implementing a system called Jim Crow. Laws that enforced racial segregation, laws that restricted the rights of formerly enslaved people, laws designed to maintain white supremacy, segregation, disenfranchisement, violence. These were the tools used to keep formerly enslaved people oppressed even after slavery ended. It would take another 100 years until the 1960s for the civil rights movement to dismantle Jim Crow. And even then, racism persisted. The wealth that was built on slavery didn't disappear. It was inherited. It was passed down through generations. The families that built their fortunes on enslaved labor used that wealth to build estates, to send their children to universities, to invest in businesses, to accumulate more wealth. And the wealth that could have been built by enslaved people. The 246 years of labor that generated trillions of dollars of wealth that was denied to them. They were freed with nothing. No land, no education, no capital, no way to build generational wealth. The result is a massive racial wealth gap. Black Americans today have significantly less wealth than white Americans. This is directly traceable to slavery, to the 246 years of stolen labor, to the deliberate denial of opportunity after emancipation, and not just wealth, education, health, life expectancy. All of these disparities can be traced back to slavery and its aftermath. Historian Eric Foner has written extensively about this. He notes that slavery created structural inequalities that persisted long after slavery ended, and in many ways, they persist today. But there's also something else, something we should understand. The resistance that enslaved people engaged in created something that slavery couldn't destroy. A culture, a community, a spirit, African American culture, the music, the art, the literature, the spirituality. It comes directly from the struggle against slavery. It comes from the resistance of enslaved people. It comes from the refusal to be reduced to property. The blues, jazz, hip-hop, these art forms emerged from the African American experience. They are, in some sense, documents of resistance, records of survival, expressions of humanity in the face of dehumanization. The spirituals that enslaved people sang, they're still sung today. They connect us to that history. They remind us of the courage of enslaved people, of their refusal to surrender their humanity, and the movement for freedom that enslaved people created. That movement didn't end with emancipation. It continued. It became the civil rights movement. It became the ongoing struggle for justice and equality. Frederick Douglass didn't live to see the civil rights movement. He died in 1895, but his words continue to inspire. His writings continue to challenge us. He wrote, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." That principle animated the civil rights movement. That principle continues to animate struggles for justice today. And the question that enslaved people raised, the question of human dignity, of human rights, of whether all people have equal value, that question has not been answered. Not fully, not completely. We live in a nation founded on the contradiction between liberty and slavery. That contradiction was supposed to be resolved in 1865, but in many ways it persists. We live in a nation where there are still massive racial inequalities, where there is still racism, where there is still a legacy of slavery. But we also live in a nation where people, black and white and brown and every color, are working to overcome that legacy, to build a more just society, to finally realize the ideals that were proclaimed at the nation's founding. It is an ongoing struggle. It is not finished. The work of freedom is never finished. As Lincoln said in his second inaugural address, the Almighty has His own purposes. And the purpose of America, the real purpose beneath the hypocrisy, might yet be to be a nation where all people are free, where all people are equal, where all people can pursue happiness. We are not there yet, but the struggle continues. And the people who resisted slavery, who fought against it, who escaped it, who rebelled against it, they showed us the way. They showed us that freedom is worth fighting for, that dignity is worth fighting for, that humanity is worth fighting for, their courage, their sacrifice, their refusal to surrender hope. That is the legacy that will not die, because as long as people remember their names, as long as people remember their stories, as long as people remember what they endured and what they resisted, slavery will not have won. The system of slavery may be gone, but the memory of it, the lessons from it, the inspiration it provides, that lives on. And perhaps, if we pay attention to that history, if we really understand what it means, perhaps we can finally overcome the legacy of slavery. Perhaps we can finally build a nation that lives up to its ideals. That work begins with remembering, with understanding what happened, with facing the truth of our history, no matter how ugly that truth is. That is why we tell these stories. That is why we remember. That is why we must never forget.